So we are in a very special period of the year between Purim and Pesach. All we have is 1 month. Last week we still were Oisik and Ilchas Purim, and in the very short, near future, we will start dealing with Ilchas Pesach. But this week we have a lull, and we will discuss one of the mitzvahs in the weekly Parsha, Parshas Ki Tisa. There are many mitzvahs. One of them is Lo Sevashel Gedi B'chalev Imoy. Isur Bishul Bosar B'cholav. So Bosar B'cholav is unique amongst all the Macholis Asuros. And this is a very broad sugya, Macholis Asuros. And Macholis Asuros, in a very basic way, are split into two different categories, Isure Achile and Isure Hanoah. Many of the Macholis Asuros are only prohibited for eating, but you could deal, you could sell, you could use them to your benefit in many other ways. Which are the Macholas Asuros that are not Osor Elo Bachila Bervad? Nevela, Treifa, all the non-kosher animals. Animals, livestock, birds, fish. All these are also Bachila Muta Bahanoah. What are the Macholas Asuros that are also Bahanoah? Orle, Kilei Kerem, Chometz BePesach. Bosar B'cholav is a machloikis tanuim. The halacha Bosar B'cholav also Bahanoah. But Bosar B'cholav is unique, Isur Bishul, and we do not find this in any other of the Macholas Asuros. We find in Isur Bishul in two different areas, Korban Pesach and Bishul B'Shabbos, but not in the context of Macholas Asuros. Bosar B'cholav is unique. So most of Hilchas Bosar B'cholav deals with Isur Achila and Isur Hanoah. We will not deal with these sugyos today. Today we're focused on Isur Bishul Bosar B'cholav. So the Torah doesn't explicitly prohibit Achila or Hanoah me Bosar B'cholav. Chulin Kuf Tezvav in the base, the Gemara says, Gimel Pa'omem Katuv B'Torah Lo Yisavashel Gedi B'chalev Imoy. The only prohibition dealing with Bosar B'cholav is Bishul. But it is 3 different times in the Torah. Echad is Achila, Echad is Hanoah, Echad is Bishul. So we learn this Achila and Hanoah from Bishul. Is there halachic implications bearing in mind based on the fact that the Torah doesn't ask Achila and Hanoah only B'loshen Bishul? Yes, in 2 different areas. One area affecting the Isra Achila of Bosar B'cholav, and the other in effect to Isra Hanoah of Bosar B'cholav. On one hand, we learn in Sanhedrin and Daladam et Beis, Derech Bishul Asra Torah. There is no Isra Diuraisa to eat Bosar B'cholav, only Derech Bishul. Minat Torah, you could spread cream cheese or cottage cheese on your steak and eat them together. That would not be an Isra Diuraisa, it would be an Isra Derabanan. But if they're cooked together and then you eat it, that would be an Isra Diuraisa. V'biur advorim, the reasoning, the rationale of this halacha is, it is only when Bosar B'cholav are cooked together and they give tam in each other. The meat has the taste of milk, and the milk will have the taste of meat. That is what we learn from Derech Bishul Asra Torah. The other halacha is in Psachim Chof Hayom Ad Aleph. All the other Asirim Shebet Torah, Shelo Kederech Hanoah is muted midiurais, it's only in his darabanan. But because Bosar B'cholav the Torah doesn't say Lo Yisoichel, or Lo Yisoichlu, or Lo Tehenu, it only says Lo Tivashel Gedi B'chalev Imoy, even Shelo Kederech Hanoah is also in the Torah. But nowhere do Chazal deal with the essence. What is defined Bishul regarding Bosar B'cholav? What is considered Bishul? These halachas are dealt with extensively regarding Shabbos, but not regarding Bosar B'cholav. And our fundamental question to start off the Shiur today is, do we learn the details, the essence of Bishul Bosar B'cholav from Shabbos? Are we medama milta la milta? Are they the same or are they different? Do they stand apart? And this is a machlokes in the great poskim in 2 different areas, and we will deal al rishon v'alachor nachan in both areas. What is the Shiur bishul regarding basa b'cholav? By Shabbos, it is kemachal ben drusai. Who was ben drusai? Ben drusai was an ancient version of Robin Hood. He was a robber. He lurked in the forests. He robbed caravans. He robbed people. What Chazal call a listim, melastim esabrios. And Rashi explains, robbers, hooligans, lurking in the forests, they don't have time to have their meat, their steak well done. It is only shlish bishuloi, chotzi bishuloi. Shabbos, person is chayev al bishul komachal ben drisoy. But some people would find it fitting for consumption. Would the same halacha apply to bishul basa b'cholav? That is a big machlokes. The Pri Chodosh, Simen Pei Zayin, Sif Koten Gimel assumes same. Why would basa b'cholav be different than Shabbos? And if machal ben drisoy chayev Shabbos, the same would apply to basa b'cholav. The Pri Magodim wonders. You forgot a Rashi. Chunin kuvches omid beis kol sha'acherem oichlem oisoi. What is defined as bishul dealing with basa b'cholav? Cherem oichlem oisoi. Rashi writes, shenesh basla kol tzorkoi. Tzorkoi kol tzorkoi is not machal ben drusai. That's the case of the Pri Magodim and the Pri Chodosh. But the Pri Magodim didn't see the ritva. Maybe the Pri Chodosh forgot Rashi, but the Pri Magodim wasn't aware of the ritva. Because on that very same Rashi, Kol Shachere Moichle Moisoi, Kos of Rashi, Shenes Vasar Kol Sorkai, the Ritva explains, Dehainu Kemachal Ben Drusai. So the machlokes between Pri Chodesh and Pri Magodim has a source in Rashi and Ritva. Pashtas Divrei Rashi would support the Pri Chodesh. Basa b'cholav is the same as Shabbos. Machal Ben Drusai, Chayev Kan, Chayev Kan. That is the Ritva. But the Pri Magodim would be based on Pashtas Divrei Rashi. No. Shabbos chayav k'machal ben drisoy. But by basa b'cholav, it is only nisbashal called sorkoi. Comes along the place here, Rabbi Yonis and Ivishitz. Kreisi, Pei Zayin, Siv Koten Gimel, quoting the Placey Tzadik Bey, Siv Koten Gimel. And the Placey quotes Rabbi Yoina Lansdorf, who was one of the great Gedolim in Germany, and his sefer is Kanfe Yoino. His name was Rabbi Yoina Lansdorf, and he argues, Basa b'cholav is chayev miyad, even before machal ben drisoy. But his argument is a technical argument, and he says, it'll take some time till the meat will be machal ben drisoy. But some of the juice or the rotev coming out of the meat and being absorbed in the milk, that will be cooked almost immediately to the level of Yad Soledes boy, and that is already defined as bishul. So the argument of the Kanfiyon in the place is a more technical one. They don't dispute the two opinions regarding the meat, and that is the machlokes Pri Chodesh and Pri Magodim. So we see that the Achronim have the disagreement. Do we compare and do we learn Bishul Basa B'cholav from Bishul B'Shabbos? And the same we find by the concept of Ein Bishul Acha Bishul. So in Shin Yud Ches and Or Chaim we know Ein Bishul Acha Bishul. This halacha is stated regarding Shabbos. Would the same apply to Basa B'cholav? Here once again, Sholosh Machlokes B'Davar. We saw Sholosh Machlokes B'Davar regarding question number 1. What is the Shiur of Bishul? We also find Sholosh Machlokes B'Davar question number 2 regarding Ein Bishul Acha Bishul. So where would we look for this halacha? Siman Pei Zayin in Yeridei? No, not really. Where? This is a striking example of what Chazal say, Divrei Torah aniyim b'mokom echad v'ashirim b'mokom achar. This halacha you got to find in Hilchas Chanukah. What does it have to do with Chanukah? How does Basa B'cholav come into Chanukah? It does, and I'll explain how. Be'er Heitev, Tov Reish Ayin Gimel, Psilas Ishmanim Shemedlikim Ben B'Chanukah, Sif Koten Aleph, quotes the Shar Ephraim, Chelek Aleph Siman Lamed Ches. Is it permissible to light Ner Chanukah with oil that is Basa B'cholav? What oil is Basa B'cholav? I don't really know. He wants to light Ner Chanukah with butter that was cooked in a fleshige kli. Or maybe the substance that he's using to light his candles actually has a taroivis of basar b'cholav. So the Shar Ephraim says, no problem, mitzvahs lav lehenois nitnu. So the performance of a mitzvah is not defined as benefit, it's not defined as hanoah. Mitzvahs lav lehenois nitnu. And therefore you could light Ner Chanukah with basar b'cholav. Comes the Eliyahu Rabbah, and he says, you made an awful mistake. So you're right, there won't be a prohibition based on Issa Noah, but what about Issa Bishul? When you light a candle, you're boiling, you're cooking the oil, because the oil needs to be transformed from a solid form to a liquid form to get into the wick, into the candle, and feed the fire. So that is Bishul. So you totally ignore the problem of Bishul basar b'cholav when you light basar b'cholav Ner Chanukah. That's the Eliyahu Rabbah. And the Pri Megadim quotes the Eliyahu Rabbah. Mishpat says, of Tov Reish Ayin Gimel, Steve Kot Narav, and the Pri Megadim agrees with him. But not everybody agrees. Yad Yehuda, one of the Choshevs Tesforim and Yehuda, in Simen Pei Zayin, Pirush HaOrach, I think it's Steve Kot Gimel, I think so, and he says, no. So the Pri Megadim and the Eliyahu Rabbah argue. Ein bishul acha bishul b'Shabbos, but by lach yesh bishul acha bishul. It is only by solids that we say in bishul acha bishul, fish, meat, potatoes, whatever it is. But when we're dealing with water or other fluids, liquids, yesh bishul acha bishul. So shemen of Ner Chanukah is liquid, yesh bishul acha bishul. The Yad Yehuda argues, no. Lach b'Shabbos yesh bishul acha bishul, but not by basar b'cholav. Shabbos is maleches machsheves. It is about tikkun, with fluids, with liquids. Once it's cooled off, then the fact that it was cooked is meaningless. You need to recook it. But by basar b'cholav, it's all about nesinas tam, as I mentioned before, derech bishul asra Torah. And if it was already cooked, it already has the flavor. Both parts, the basar and the b'cholav, already have the flavor and the taste of each other. And therefore, ein bishul acha bishul. There's some Sofer Tshuvas Yeridei Pei Beis, as one is the Pri Megadim Simen Kuf Hey, add on a little touch to the Yad Yehuda. Not that they quote the Yad Yehuda. The Yad Yehuda was younger than them by 60 or 70 years. But they go in the same mahalach, and they say, if the meat was cooked separately, the milk was cooked separately, and you're the one that cooks them together, vaday sheyesh yisur bishul basar b'cholav, because they were not nice and tam zeh b'zeh previously, and that is what you're doing now. But if the basar b'cholav was cooked together, even though it's cooled off, according to the Yad Yehuda, there would be no isur, because basar b'cholav is different than Shabbos. And the Shvus Yankov goes to the other extreme. Shvus Yankov was a brother-in-law of the Eliyahu Rabbah. So it would only be natural if they stick together. If he would disagree with his brother-in-law, he definitely would say so. But he does happen to agree. And they were both great Gedolim. So Shvus Yankov, the Shoyal and the Shvus Yankov, who is anonymous, we don't know who he was. But to me, he seems to be a great Talmud Chacham. And he argues against the Eliyahu Rabbah. And he comes to Bimiyashev, the opinion of the Shar Ephraim. When you put on a ner, a candle, there is no Issa Bishul basar b'cholav. So the Shoyal argues, basar b'cholav Bishul is only when the Bishul renders the machal fitting for consumption. That is what basar b'cholav is all about. But cooking oil and burning it simultaneously, as the oil is cooked, it is absorbed into the wick and into the fire, and it's consumed by fire. That would not be included in the Issa Bishul basar b'cholav. That is a Bishul Shel Keloyin, not a Bishul Shel Achona. The Shvus Yankov rejects his argument, and I don't really know why. Because the reasoning of the Shvus Yankov to reject his argument is not really clear. The Shvus Yankov brings various different halachas and different sources in which we are more machmir by basar b'cholav than by Shabbos. But why is that relevant? I think the argument of the Shoyal is a powerful argument. But in Chuvas Chasam Sofer or Der Tzadik Beis, he goes to the contrary, Adarabah, to the extreme. And the Chasam Sofer says, putting on a candle would not be considered bishul b'Shabbos. It would, yes, be considered bishul agabe bosa b'cholov. And why is that? Shabbos, we need dumya de mishkan, bishul samemonim, afiyas apas. By Shabbos, you're only chayev if after the bishul, hadover hanizbashel hu be'ein, and it is fitting for use or consumption. But a bishul that consumes the dover amizbashel techef miyad in the process of bishul, that would not be malaches musheves. However, bosa b'cholov he would be chayiv, because by bosa b'cholov doesn't need malaches musheves. Any cooking of bosa b'cholov, any form, any style, any way, would be an issa of mavashel bosa b'cholov. That's the Chasam Sofer. And I find it easier to identify with the Shiur and Shvis Yankiv than with the Chasam Sofer on two different counts. Number one, the Chasam Sofer writes, when you're lighting a ner, that is not taking benefit out of the Dover HaMizbashel. You're just destroying it. I don't think so. I think it is direct benefit. It is simultaneous. But you light the candle, and the solid is transformed to liquid. And it is only being liquid that it's nechnas l'torch ha'esh and nechnas l'torch ha'ner. So you do bear direct benefit from the bishul. If not the bishul, you wouldn't have the fire. It is simultaneous. So obviously, the Sofer feels dumya the mishkan. And by the mishkan, after gemara bishul, you finish cooking, you have the result. It's on the table. You have a loaf of bread. You have bishul samemonim. But I wrote a very substantial siman in which I tried to define the concept of dumya de mishkan. And I think I brought about 15 different sources from the Gemara till the Achronim. And my conclusion was, dumya de mishkan is only in the essence of the malacha, the mahus, not in oifen asiyas malacha, because nothing we do today is even remotely dumya de mishkan. We're in a changing world. And in the past few decades, the pace of change is just mind-boggling. So nothing we do today is really Dumya de Mishkan. So my fundamental argument is Dumya de Mishkan only applies to the essence of Malacha, not the way we do Malachas. So why would there be a difference whether the Dover HaMizbashel is Chaim Li'achar HaBishul and you consume in a later stage or you consume right away? Tzorach Iyun. On the other hand, I think the argument of the Shiur and Shvis Yaakov is such a powerful argument. After all, as I explained at the beginning of this year, Bosa b'cholov is one of the many macholos asuros. And macholos asuros are first and foremost, primarily about Isur Achila. And therefore I think it's mistaver. Keshem she'amru Chazal, there is no Isur Achila ela derech bishul. I would add on, there's no Isur bishul elo derech Achila. And the essence of Isur Bosa b'cholov is Hechshores adovar la'achila. And therefore, putting on a candle in which you consume the oil, solid fuel, liquid fuel, that would not be defined as bishul regarding Bosa b'cholov. And this brings us to another question. But first of all, let's just conclude the Shvis Yaakov. The Shvis Yaakov argues, even by Yavish, regarding Bosa b'cholov, yesh bishul achar bishul. And that is 100% different than the Yad Yehuda. The Yad Yehuda argued, even balach ein bishul achar bishul. Shvis Yaakov says, even by Yavish, yesh bishul achar bishul. And I find it very easy to understand the Shiur and the Chasam Sofer as I explained before. And this brings us to a new sugya. Kosav Rambam. Perek Tes Haloch Alav Melchus Macholas Asuros, and that is the perek in which the Rambam deals with the Yisar Basa B'Cholav. The Torah writes 3 times Lo Savasha Gedi B'Chlei V'Moy, and we learn Echad Es Rachila, Echad Es Ano, Echad Es Abishul. That's the Mama Chazal which we started today's Shiur. The Rambam explains why doesn't the Torah clearly write Lo Seichel Basa B'Cholav? It's a Kal V'Choyma. If the Torah asks Bishul, we could learn that Kal V'Choyma Rachila would be also. And the Rambam goes over the same svara. Perek Alav Halacha Beis Averchas Tumas Meis. And then Rambam writes, Torah doesn't write Tumas Meis. We learn Tumas Meis Kal V'Chomer from Tumas Sheretz. So the Rambam writes, just like the Torah doesn't ask Abbas, because we learn Is Abbas from Bas Abbas, and the Torah doesn't write Is Rachila Basa B'Cholav because we can learn Is Rachila from Is Bishul, Torah doesn't state Tumas Meis because we learn it from Tumas Sheretz. So the Rambam twice in Mishnah Torah explains, Isra Achilu we learn Kal V'Chomer from Isra Bishul. Comes along the Kesef Mishnah, and he writes a big Chiddush. The entirety of Isra Bishul Basa B'Cholav is a harchoka and a siag, like a gzeira. We shouldn't cook, lest we eat. Do we find gzeiras and harchokas and siagim b'diurai? So we do. And I wrote a big, big siman about this question. It's in Minchas Osha Moyadim. The earliest sources of is the Reb Nosson. Perek Beis, the Reb Nosson says, Su siag leTorah, because the Torah makes a siag, and we should do the same. Where did the Torah make a siag? Kreve de erve. That is Perek Beis of is the Reb Nosson. So the Kesef Mishnah explains, the entire Isra of Bishul is only Exeira Shemi Yovelechon. So if it's Exeira Shemi Yovelechon, we could fairly assume there would be no Isra Bishul only if it's Shayach La'achar Bishul to eat. And that is not the case when you light a candle. So 100 years ago, or almost 100 years ago, Reb Meir Shapira, the Rav of Lublin, best known for the Daf Yomi and Yeshivas Chacham Lublin, got a shayla from chemist. And the chemist writes, sometimes we need to examine chocolate to determine whether there's a chash bosa b'cholav in milchige chocolate. The way to do it in our lab is we cook a little piece. But if it is bosa b'cholav, would I have a problem with bishul bosa b'cholav? That was the question. And Meir Shapira sent the question to the Chabina Rav. And we find his tshuva, La Rabba Shel Gluna, and that was where Meir Shapira was Rav in his younger years. Doivev Mishuram Chelak Aleph Siman Lamed. And the Chabina Rav says, according to the Lecha Mishnah, the entire Isra of Bishul is only Gzeir Shem Yovel Echol, we could be matir. Based on the Gemara Psochim, the Gemara says, when a person is boidek chometz, we're not choshesh, he might eat the chometz. Why? Because the entire bedika is to get the chometz out of the house and to destroy it and to be makayim teshbisu sa'or. So when a person is out to destroy a certain machal, we're not choshesh, he might eat it. So Shabbat Rav says, if the Issa Bishul Basa B'Cholav is only Exeira Shemi Yovel Echol, and the only reason this chemist is cooking that substance is to determine, is it Basa B'Cholav, and we throw it away, then there should be no Issa Bishul. But then the Shabbat Rav rightfully says, Lo darshinan ta'ame dikra. And there is no necessity in accepting the perush of the Kesef Mishnah that Bishul is only a gzeira. We don't need to go that far. It is enough if we would say, Ein Yisra Bishul, Ela Mishum Sheyesh Yisra Achila, but not that it's a gzeira. So Shabbat Rav definitely says we cannot be Machadash Halachas based on the Kesef Mishnah, and definitely not Kulis. Maybe we could be Machmir based on the Kesef Mishnah, but definitely not a Kula. So we have discussed various different topics and various different inyonim in this fascinating sugya of Bishul Basa B'Cholav. And it might seem to be slightly amusing, but I realize that almost every shiur I say, today we're going to be Yosek in a fascinating sugya. And it's true. I cannot recall whether I ever was Yosek in a sugya that is not a fascinating sugya. That's the nature of Torah Seinu HaKadosh Arucha Me'eretz Midor HaChovim and Yam, and every sugya is and should be fascinating sugi. And we dealt with different aspects in the Isur of Bishul Bosa Machana. In this week's parsha, we read about Chetu Egel. Chetu Egel is a mystery, and it always was. It is so unreasonable, inconceivable, unacceptable to assume that that great generation that witnessed Ma'amad Har Sinai, that witnessed Kriyas Yamsuf, Seres Hamakas, how would they fall into the depths of Avodah Zorah? They saw what they saw, they experienced what they experienced. By Ma'amad Har Sinai, they were elevated to the Madrega of Malach HaShoros, V'gdimu Nasra Nishba. By Kriyas Yamsuf, they were elevated to the Madrega of Yechezkel HaNovi V'kol HaNaviim. How could they lose it all in such a short period? There are rayas from Midrash Chazal, from the Rishonim, and from many of the great Achronim. Recently, in the Sefer Leket Sichas Misa, Shmusin from Rabbi Isaac Shiur, Rosh Yeshiva Slobodka, there's a beautiful mamar on this topic. And the consensus is, it couldn't have been real Avodah Zorah. So what was it? What did they have in mind, making the Egel Hazov, the golden calf? So many of these great giants explain, they thought Moshe died. And that is what the Sultan convinced them. He showed them in the heavens, Kidmus Mutosoi Shel Moshe Rabbeinu. And they fell into despair. And it was clear to them that no human being could take the place of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was the one and only. He was the giant who could come in the place of Moshe Rabbeinu, and therefore they thought that HaKadosh Baruch Hu might prefer leading them with an egel. And the Beis Halevi really asked, what is the difference between the egel and the kruvim? Why are the kruvim kodesh kodeshim and the egel is chulei chulin? The kruvim weren't static. They were dynamic. The Gemara in Yumin Undalet says, when the Oivim came into the Heichal B'Shas Chor Mabayis, the Kruvim hugged each other. So the Kruvim are dynamic. So the Beis Halevi asks, what is the difference between the Egel and the Kruvim? If our interpretation of the Egel was that they planned that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would show them the way by this Egel. So the Beis Halevi says something very simple. Simple and profound. The difference between the Egel and the Kruvim is Kechut Asaro and Kekoiras Beis Abad. HaKadosh Baruch Hu asked us to make Kruvim. He did not request Egel. And that is all the difference. That is all the difference. The Kruvim are mitzvahs Hashem, and that is why they're Kodesh Kodeshim. The Egel, HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not request, and that is why it has Tumas Avodah Zorah. Many years ago, I saw a beautiful drash from Reb Baruch Frankel. He was the great Baruch Tam. I am a great admirer of Reb Baruch Frankel. He was the shred of the Divrei Chaim. He was a Misnaged, but his son-in-law was a Rebbe, and not Stam a Rebbe. He was the founder of the Tzanz Shoshelas. My Rebbe, the Kloisenberger Rebbe, was a descendant, fourth generation from the Tzanz Arov. But the Baruch Tam was a huge Goen, a big palpalan, and he has a beautiful Sefer al Torah Margeni Sedarav. And he says, Kodesh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu, Lech reid ki shiches amcho. Lech reid. Go down, descend. Reb Baruch Tam notes, reid is two aces, two letters, Reish and Daled. Reish and Daled make all the difference. In Parshas V'eschanan, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad has a big Daled, Daled Rabosi. In this week's Parsha, Lo Yisishtacha V'la'el Acher, Parshas Kitiso, the Reish is big, has a big Reish. Why is that? So Reb Baruch Frankel explains, examine these two letters. What is the difference between them? The gag of the Daled and the Reish. It's a little koitz, a little dot. So the Daled pulls more right than the Reish. And the difference between Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad and Lo Yishtachave Le'el Achar is small and it's big. As small as a raindrop, as big as an iceberg. And it is in the koitz of the Dalet. And that is why HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us a big Dalet, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, and a big Reish. I want you to notice they're not the same. They are a zillion years, light years apart. They might look the same, but they're as far can be. So we have the big Dalet and the big Reish. Kadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe, we failed. They failed. They confused Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad and Lo Yishtachave Le'el Acher. Leich reid, Rashi brings reid migdulascho. We might as well have that Reish and Dalet made smaller. It was to no avail. I thought that would keep them away from Avodah Zorah, but it did not. They still confused the Dalet and the Reish. Do you remember any other posuk? Exactly the same two words, Leich Reid? Yes, just a few weeks ago in Parshas Yisro. Moshe Rabbeinu ascends on the mountain to the heaven, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Leich Reid, v'atu v'yaharon, v'alisem el hahar, v'koyanim v'ha'am al yaharsu lalois, Leich Reid. It is the same Leich Reid. From Kabbalah Satorah, and tragically after the Chet and Egel, and it's all about the Dalet and the Reish. The Baruch Tam goes on to beautifully explain by Yodam Rishon, when he was cursed, Koitz v'dar dar tartzmiach lecha. Dar is Dalet Reish. One Dalet Reish, Leich Reid, Atov Yaharon v'alisam bahar, and the other Dalet Reish, Leich Reid kishichas amcha. And the difference between the Dalet and the Reish is the koitz, that little koitz, that little dot on the right of Gagoy Shel Dalet, and that is koitz v'dar dar tatzmiach lecha. What a beautiful drash. But the moral of the story and the essence is, yes, the difference between Hashem Echad and El Acher, as I said, kechut asara v'kekoiles beis abad, as small as a raindrop and bigger than an iceberg. So the difference between the kruvim and the egel was the kruvim, that is Mrs. Hashem. That is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu demanded. He did not request the egel. This is Kodesh Kodeshim, and that's Chule Chulen. This is Eser Kedushois, and that is Avi Avois Hatumo. And that's the difference between the two. So in Jewish life, it's not always easy to define and to differentiate between good and bad, between a mitzvah and an avera, between Kodesh Kodeshim and Chule Chulen. And the only way to understand is with Shimush Talmidei Chachamim. And that is so essential at Shamru Chazal, Godol Shimusha Yoiso Milimuda. So we should always be Zoicha LeKadosh Shemayim, and this is a very special period between Purim and Pesach, Hasmuchi Geula LeGeula, and it's a time to daven. It's a time to rejoice. Some Rishonim say, Mishenechnas Od HaMarben B'Simcha, and that is till after Pesach. These are days of Simcha. So let us thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for His chasodim, and let us rejoice in His mitzvahs. And we should be Zoicha B'Kora B'Yameinu, once again to see Nisim V'Neflois, B'Geulas Olam, B'Bias Mashiach Tzidkeinu, B'Mheiro V'Yomeinu. Amen.